r/AskReddit. People who have worked as forensic photographers, what picture you took traumatized you for a long time? Standard. Not a forensic photographer, but I worked in a forensic lab doing autopsies for a bit. An older woman who died was brought to rule out foul play. She had been dead in her home for several days, so the smell was horrific. She had several days of urine and stool in and on her clothes. Her vagina had prolapsed and there were maggots eating away at it. The prolapse had caused an ascending urinary tract infection leading to sepsis, which likely killed her. It had reached her kidneys, and when we cut into the kidney it exploded pus everywhere and the smell almost made me pass out. This was my first day on the job and I very nearly did not go back. I'm an X-ray tech. We occasionally have to take X-rays on babies who have been abused. When I was in X-ray school, my son was born. I had to take post-mortem X-rays on a baby abuse victim that was only a few months off from my son's age. It is a full body series of X-rays, and in my 10 years of doing this, that is the one thing that really messed me up. In nuclear medicine school, I had to do a brain death scan on a 7-year-old that had drowned but was able to be revived. Unfortunately, he had no flow to the brain, so he was brain dead. I'll remember that forever. We also did PET scans on pediatric patients, and seeing a young kid that's full of cancer was so heartbreaking. Thank God we don't do young kids in our NUX department where I work. My husband works with crime scene photos, and even though I could probably handle some of the photos, I'm not allowed to look, and I do respect the people's privacy of who he has pictures of. One day, for some reason, his phone was left unlocked, not properly closed, and a picture was enlarged on the screen. Nothing crazy, just a younger kid with blank stare wearing a backpack, and he was on the playground by the chin-up bars. Not knowing it was his work phone, I asked who the kid was. Maybe a colleague's kid, a friend etc. to see if I knew him. Turns out it was a crime scene photo. Kid hung himself after school on the chin-up bars, which were much too short to hang on. In the next photo I saw the bottom half of his body, which broke my heart. His legs were bent. I always pictured hanging suicides as up high, the person struggling, maybe even regretting their decision. Seeing his legs bent showed how much determination he had to die. No blood, no guts, and still the most unsettling photo I've even seen. I didn't personally take the photo, but my cousin did. He used to be a crime scene photographer. It was of a man in his 60s. His nephew had mental problems and snapped one day. The nephew stabbed the man over 50+ times in the face and chest area. The man was found in the woods by a road, and the body had been there for almost a week, so Mother Nature took a toll on the body. A coyote had gotten to the body and a leg was missing. The photos from where the body was found and from the apartment still haunt my memory sometimes. I used to work in a photo lab that developed pictures for a number of local police departments before the digital age came about. Since I was the lab manager, I was the one to develop those sensitive crime scene photos. Mind you, this was about 20 years ago, but some really stuck out. The worst? Definitely the death of a young child. He was around 2-3 years old. I believe it was death by strangulation. But it's not like we were told any details from the PD on pending investigations. We were just warned in advance. It was especially ducked up since the child was that the child's eyes were open and bulging. The skin was blue and even more purple around the neck and face. I can't get that shit out of my head. The craziest? A dismembered body in a Tupperware container. It was found on a rooftop loosely covered in concrete, and the body was there for easily a decade. The head and hands were missing. Just the torso, legs in pieces, and arms. What really stood out to me is that the torso resembled a dried out and cooked turkey. I ended up looking for an article years later to find out it was a mob hit. Others to note would be the usual gunshot fatalities and also fatal car crashes. I got pretty desensitized to seeing the images, and just focused on color correcting. But that young kid was beyond messed up. Obligatory not me but my dad. Back in the day before digital cameras, he had the only photo developing lab for 50 miles in a fairly well-known outdoor destination. With no other nearby services, he would develop the photos for all deaths, accidents, etc. It was pretty common for people to fall off the cliffs and die, but those photos weren't the worst. According to him, the one that tops the list is a lost hiker who figured if he could climb up a cliff he'd be able to see where he was. So guy starts climbing and gets surprisingly far but eventually gets to a spot he has to chimney up. Basically 2 flat parallel walls and you climb them with the friction you get pushing off the walls. Guy makes it almost out but then loses it. From the blood smears on the wall you could see how he used his hands to try to stop his fall almost the whole way down. In the pictures the hands were worn through to the bone. Definitely not the way I'd want to go. Classic, I'm not a photographer, but I'm a criminal defense attorney, so I'll look at a lot of crime scene and autopsy photos. The only one that really sticks with me is the first set of autopsy photos I saw. I got a folder with the court transcripts, filings, and documents for the case. There was an envelope clipped to the inside. I usually don't get multimedia evidence until a little later, so I figured it was a supplemental court document of some sort and popped the contents onto the desk. It was not. It was the medical examiner's photos of the victim. Lacerations all over their body, bone deep in places, with an apparently large blade. What got burned into my mind for whatever reason was the subcutaneous fat. It wasn't at all like I expected fat to look, and for some reason that made it all the more disturbing. I was totally unprepared to see it and I still curse whoever it was that didn't label me that envelope. I used to study forensic science and we had a guest speaker on the subject of making crime scenes photos. She got asked what the most effed up crime scene was she took photos of. She told the class that she actually had some of the photos from the crime scene in question. But first everyone who wanted to leave, cause the photos from before were nowhere close to what she would be talking and showing. Now till that point she had shown pictures of stabbings, gang violence and a person who died in a fire. So some people were smart enough to leave, but morbid curiosity is a beach. She showed pictures of the inside of a shed with tools, a workbench with some blood on it, meat hooks, etc. She wasn't allowed to show all of the pictures, but she started to tell the story of a serial killer who killed people who went camping in the nearby wilderness. So far pretty ducked up, but nowhere that traumatizing. The guy liked to hunt and dismember his victims. In certain cases eat some of them and take trophies of those he ate. Okay, more ducked up, but so far not the most ducked up pictures we seen that day. The last pictures were of his trophy case, a shelf of small children's shoes. She had to take photos of every pair. Edit. So I got a few PMs and one person below asked about the case. So I thought of making a Reddit for other people who might have the same question. The guest lecture happened about 5 years ago and for privacy reasons a lot of information about the victims and case were not shared. The only thing I remember that it happened quite a few years pre-2000 ago, and it happened in a rural part of America. I live in West EU, so I can't tell you much about it. Expect what I was told and remember. We don't have full-time photographers, but as a police officer evidence tech the photo that sticks with me the most is a domestic violence suspect's hands. I took a photo of them just after he was arrested. They are handcuffed behind his back, showing his sagging pants and boxers, and the victim's blood covering his hands. He didn't have a scratch on him. He was active duty Navy and did some time for that. She lived. The photo alone ducked him in court and he took a plea deal. I paid for my camera DSLR out of my own pocket and felt good about getting my money's worth on that shot alone. Husband is a cop. He has told horrific ones, but the one that ducked him up most was a girl whose body looked like mine. Same hair color and style of dress. We were going through similar depression issues at the time, and this girl took a shotgun to her head. There wasn't a face left and for him, because I was also very depressed at the time, and the bodies were so alike. He said all he could see was me lying there. Apparently her skull shattered so much that there was no surface without blood or bone on it, but her brain had ejected mostly intact. He had to go to therapy for a while after that one. I'm a trauma nurse, so usually when I see gore the person is still alive and that is a whole different ballgame. But HIPAA laws exist so I won't be sharing. Not my picture but an old friend. 20 plus years New York detective showed me a picture that to this day still irks me. A man with a screwdriver stuck in his eye, with the tip sticking out of the back of the skull. All of his teeth were kicked into his mouth. Turns out his brother and he had argued over how much of some drug shipment they would divide up and the living brother decided he wanted it all. I mean, You stab someone in the eye, it's one thing, but to go overboard and just start kicking his face in with your shoe that you push all of his teeth into his throat. I ducking stared at that picture for 30 minutes and took a good day or two to stop replaying what was that guy's last few moments. He acted like it was a restaurant menu and just another Tuesday at work. Not a forensic photographer, but when I was a sophomore in college I took some criminal justice classes taught by an old ex-cop. He was friends with some equally old forensic photographers and on occasion he'd show us photos and let us guess the method of death. We were nearly always wrong. The bulk of the photos were of elderly people who had died in their homes of natural causes but not been found for a while. Or if they had been found, it was by the flies or their hungry pets first. We always thought they'd been beaten to death. But the one that stuck in my mind and convinced me that no way in hell I could ever be a cop was the day he showed us pics of little kids who had been killed by their parents. This one toddler, his piece of crap father had repeatedly swung him by the heels, slamming his head into the toilet even after he died, until the toilet basin broke. The kid's crime? Not being toilet trained. That poor baby was not even 2 years old. If I'd been a cop on that case, I would have killed that sob and then spent the rest of my life in prison. Those pics wrecked everyone in my class. Was the last time the professor showed us kid pics. That was over 20 years ago and I still tear up to remember that damn photo. If you are someone with gore sensitivity, vivid imagination, and or happen to be eating, turn the duck around and follow that back button out of here. I once curated an archive of forensic crime scene photographs for a city's police department. They told me lots of times TV show movie production staff would use the photos for reference, especially because the photos depict what actual home interiors looked like. Inadvertently, over time, there was one set of photos from the 60s of a tidy suburban home and some poor middle-aged woman who had been raped and strangled in the middle of the day. The banal setting and the fact they depicted a real person and a real crime really haunted me. That was a difficult project, since every photo I looked at was something horrible. Obligatory not a forensic photographer. I am an insurance adjuster on high-value bodily injury claims. The things that can happen to a human body in a high-velocity impact are unforgettable. Bad dog bite cases stick with me too. But my personal least favorite are degloving amputation combinations. I had one a few years ago where the injured party's arm was crushed, degloved from forearm down to hand with half the hand torn off. That one has stuck with me. Not a photographer but used to be an evidence clerk in a courthouse. Photos of a 4-year-old girl that got attacked and killed by a pack of hunting dogs in her backyard. There were over 100 photos of chunks of flesh, hair/clothes strewn all over the 5-acre backyard. So due to lockdown, my old friend who lost touch called me and talks about work came up and he told me the work he has done as a forensic professional haunts him sometimes. Then I asked about forensic photographers as one of my nieces want to be one. So I guess I wanted to have stories. I know posting pictures isn't a great option, so a little bit of background would do. Not me, but my ex was a detective and sometimes had files with him. The homeless guy who got run over by the train is something I can't unsee. Well, it wasn't him, it was his entrails stretched along the track. But he claims the worst photos were from a couple guys who got arrested for bestiality with horses. Thankfully he never brought those photos home. Not a forensic photographer. I worked as a 911 dispatcher for a few years and had access to crime scene photos. Sometimes when it was slow I would look up interesting cases, homicides, suicides, etc. and read the case files, look at the photos to pass the time. One in particular still sticks with me. It was an elderly man whose friends had all passed away. It was just him and his wife, and they had just gone to the funeral of his best friend that week. He was feeling alone and depressed, while his wife was out of the house. He decided to end it. He wanted to be considerate, though, and not leave a mess inside the house. So he took his gun outside and tried to shoot himself under the chin in his gravel driveway. Trouble is, he didn't have a handgun. He had a longish gun, rifle, maybe, can't remember, and couldn't get a good angle while still reaching the trigger. He ended up ducking it up and shooting up through his palate and out his cheek, near the eye. After the first shot, he was bleeding and hurt, but fully conscious, alert, and aware of his surroundings. Based on the crime scene photos, you can tell what happened next. This man changed his mind and wanted to live. He went back in the house, through the garage so he didn't track any blood, and went to the bathroom just off the garage. He stood and looked at the damage in the mirror, and based on the blood pooling he was there for several minutes, just examining his injury and trying to decide what to do. Should he call an ambulance? Should he call his wife and tell her what he did? Could he even talk with his face like that? What kind of life would an old man like him have left with half his face blown off? Well, he must have found his answer, because the blood trailed back out the garage and to another spot in the driveway, the spot where his wife found his dead body, with not one but 2 bullets to the head. I think a lot about those few minutes he spent in the bathroom, looking at what he had done. What would that feel like? What was the thought process like? Was he emotional and distraught? Was he in shock and weirdly calm while he examined his injuries? Did he recognize himself? Did he feel the pain? Did he think about what he had left to live for? I also think about the consideration. He was doing something for him. Something he knew would hurt his wife and possibly traumatize her if she was the one to find the body. So he decided to do what he could to minimize the mess. That small act of love really sticks with me. I might be leaving you, but I'll make sure I only bleed on things that will be easy to clean. The driveway, the garage, the tile bathroom, just damn. My mom wasn't a photographer, but she used to develop photos for the Portland Police Department back in the 90s. And the most disturbing set of photos she ever had to develop came from a crack house where police had found a dead child with burns, bruises, etc. all over his body. Obligatory, not my story but my dad's. Please forgive any mistakes, English isn't my first language. Anyways, a bit of context before the story. We live in Mexico and my dad used to work for Kodak back in the 80s. When the earthquake of 1985 hit and it became obvious that the amount of bodies recovered overwhelmed the hospitals and morgues, the government started using an old baseball field to lay down the bodies so people with missing family could check if they were there. Anyways, it became horrible fast how much of a terrible idea it was. Bodies laid under the sun all day for days leave a pretty awful smell, so the government hired Kodak to take photos of the bodies and make an album for people to check. Then threw all the bodies into a communal tomb. My dad was in charge of making these albums and checking that the photos were taken correctly. He always came back looking horrible, like he had seen a ghost. He used to tell me about the photos of people whose face was completely crushed. Children, babies that some limbs were amputated by the debris. The government claimed a very low level of deaths compared to the unholy amount of photos Kodak took. Many bodies were never claimed or identified. He always hated talking about those days, even so I miss him. He was a great dad, but he sadly died of Ella a few years back. Not a forensic photographer but used to be friends of someone who was. Guy had come off a motorcycle at warp speed, inverted. The gravel had ground his head off down to the shoulders, so the images were of a headless body at the end of a great long red smear on the roadway. Not a photographer, but I've seen uncensored pictures of 9/11 jumpers and I will never forget them. My best friend was a forensic photographer in Australia. She once had to take photos of a dead baby behind a toilet. She left the force a little while later and was diagnosed with severe PTSD. She hasn't been able to work since 2012 because of her depression, anxiety and PTSD from the job. Not a human forensic, but working with animals means you do it all. Had to take pictures for a severe animal abuse case. Dog had acid poured down its back. Died once it had eaten through into the bones and body cavity. Dog had arrived at our hospital alive and I couldn't get a vein to euthanize it because it was so dehydrated and malnourished. Ended up injecting directly into its heart through ragged tissue. A degloved body of a living human picked up after weeks in the water following a hurricane. Medical school with forensic pathology lecture. The county coroners brought slides, including a drug dealer who was clunked on the head and stuffed in his trunk in 100-degree weather until he started leaking out onto the ground. Looked like a human rotten banana. The coroner resigned the next day. Worse than the pics of bodies pulled from the river. And right before lunch. A child, face down, in pajamas. Same pajamas as my son who was the same age, same build, same hair. I threw my son's pajamas away. Obligatory, not a forensic photographer, just a layperson. However, one photo that got to me, I saw on the internet for the first time when I was maybe 15 and I've never forgotten it. It's semi-famous in pro-honor communities. If you mention it, chances are someone will know what you're talking about. It was the autopsy of a 19-year-old girl with an ED whose mother posted it online hoping to warn other people. I believe she died binging and purging because her stomach exploded. And the photo is of this pale, emaciated, almost inhuman looking corpse with a distended stomach slumped over a toilet. Her limbs are purple with bruising from the blood settling. Another photo displays the new 5 or 6, I forget, measured liters of her stomach contents. It just really struck something in me. It's one thing to tell a suicidal teenager this could kill you, but it's entirely different to see the photo and know you could die like that. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.